Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at a pretty special motherboard. This is the Gigabyte X99 SOC-Champion. I've recently gotten my hands on it because OC UK was pretty much giving these away. They were 100 quid for one of the best X99 overclocking motherboards. And yeah, I hate X99, but nonetheless, I had to own this thing. So I've gone ahead and got one. And it is a really cool motherboard, and like Gigabyte has gone absolutely insane with some things on this board and not so insane on some other things. So we're going to be going through all of that. I'm not going to be going over the like main feature set like connectivity. You can all see that more or less, or you can just go on Gigabyte's website and look up the spec if you're still interested in this board for whatever reason. But really, this board is a bit stripped down in terms of connectivity. Like there's not a lot of USB down there, and or anywhere really, because this is a motherboard focused almost entirely on extreme overclocking, and that's why it has the SOC-Champion name. This thing is basically Gigabyte takes, like, this thing is so focused on overclocking that it's stripped down. It's more stripped down than, say, something like an Apex. An Apex has is still better equipped than this. Like, this is all out, I need to get more gigahertz, nothing else matters. The only thing that I'd say is still a leftover is the audio section. I think they could have completely scrapped that as well, along with most of the other things they've dropped, but hey, I guess people do still need sound on their motherboards at the end of the day. So we'll start off with some of the more basic stuff, and then we'll move into the actual VRM stuff, which is probably what everybody is interested in anyway. And starting with the basic stuff, right here you have a 6-pin power connector for your 4-way, 3-way SLI crossfire setups. Because if you're really hammering some things like, say, GTX 480s, I think are pretty notorious for it, or say RX 480s. Funny how that works out, isn't it? 480s are bad for PCIe slots in general. So basically, those cards, as far as I'm aware, pull a lot of power from the PCIe. And the problem is, your PCIe slots, normally, if you don't have that power connector right there, are entirely powered by the two 12-volt pins on a 24-pin. There's not a lot of 12-volt connectivity on the 24-pin. So the end result is that those two pins get really overloaded if you're running a 4-way or a 3-way crossfire setup or a SLI setup with the wrong card. You overload those two pins and they burn out. So you get that 6-pin power connector there to avoid that issue. Personally, I don't like where it is, but if you think about it, if they put it on the bottom edge here, it would take up a lot more space because they'd have to put it at an angle, so they'd have to like rearrange the entire I/O down there. And for extreme overclocking, this doesn't matter. This is really a problem for like daily builds, but why would you be using this in a daily build? This is an extreme overclocking motherboard, so the fact that you have to route your power cable here through the I/O, who cares? It's probably going to be on a test bench anyway. Now let's pull off the heat sinks, or heat blocks. They're not very thinned, are they? But at least this cooling system is actually, it is actually a really nice cooling system, and it is necessary on this motherboard, and we'll go into that very soon. But you do have this massive cooling system, and you can see that there's no thermal pad on either of these two wings, so all of the memory power and all of that doesn't actually get any active, like they don't get any heat sinking. This is all basically to just cool the CPU VRM. Even the chipset, which is technically part of the heatsink down here, that's not really going to put out as much heat as the VRM. What's going to end up happening is that VRM is going to get hot under full load, and then all of that heat from the VRM is going to transfer into the chipset. So ultimately, this is just a giant VRM heatsink, heat block. There really isn't that much finning on this. I mean, it's not terrible. Like, you have some finning there. There's an okay surface amount of surface area, but it's not amazing. It could certainly have more cooling capability, but we'll go into that. You definitely would want to still use this on like liquid nitrogen. This is not one of those platforms where you can just ignore the VRM heatsink, because on LN2, your ice will freeze through to the VRM. This VRM will get hot on X99, and we will go into that very soon. And actually, this will give you a glimpse of some of the issues that X299 is also dealing with in terms of VRM cooling. So let's put the heatsink away and talk about why you need it. The V-Core VRM gets power from a 4-pin over here and an 8-pin down there. It is an 8-phase VRM controlled by an International Rectifier 3580 8-phase voltage controller, so that's completely fine. What isn't completely fine is that this true 8-phase is merely made up of international rectifier IR3556 power stages. These are 50 amp power stages, which in my opinion is really, really underwhelming for an extreme overclocking motherboard, because there is a stronger power stage available that would fit in that same footprint. Gigabyte could have gone with 60 amp power stages, which would have definitely improved the capabilities of this motherboard, because ultimately the end result here is that the maximum power capability of this VRM for continuous power output is about 400 amps. And I'm not sure what temperature it'll do it at, because the problem is international rectifier power stages, and actually all power stage components, are designed for optimal efficiency at around 10% duty cycle. Which would be fine on something like Kaby Lake, Skylake, Sandy Bridge, any older architecture, that would be fine. Your 10% optimized duty cycle really is optimal because you're working at low voltage. However, Broadwell E and Haswell E and now as well Skylake X all use a fully integrated voltage regulator, and obviously you can't fit Skylake X onto it, but it does suffer from the same issue because all those motherboards also use power stages. So the thing about power stages is they're really, really not meant for operating at almost 20% duty cycle. For example, on Haswell E and Broadwell E, your stock VCC in voltage, so the voltage produced by this VRM that goes into the fiber of the CPU, the fully integrated voltage regulator in the CPU, and that then gets down converted into VCore, VCCSA, VCCIO, and all the other voltages that your CPU actually runs on. Well, the voltage that comes out of this VRM at stock is 1.8 volts. If you're overclocking on air cooling and water cooling, you'd be looking at a range of between 1.9 and 2.1 volts. And if you're on liquid nitrogen, you might go as high as 2.3 or 2.4 volts. Higher voltages than that on liquid nitrogen will actually kill CPUs. Higher than 2.1 volts on air cooling or water cooling will cause theoretically rapid degradation or instantaneous death. Either or. It really depends on how unlucky you are when, depending on what happens. So that's a problem, isn't it? But the main issue is these power stages are designed for basically optimum efficiency at around 1.2 volts output. At 2 volts output, these things lose something like produce an extra 40% heat. The end result being that, well, this VRM will produce a lot more heat for any given current. Now, there is a benefit to the fully integrated voltage regulator in that, say, a Haswell E5960X or a Broadwell E6950X on liquid nitrogen at full load, so we're talking like Cinebench or XTU, and for Broadwell E, around 5 gigahertz core clock, and for Haswell E in excess of 5 gigahertz, like 5.5, maybe even 6 gigahertz. At those kind of core clocks, 5960Xs and Haswell and 6950Xs will pull between 500 and 600 watts. And the bonus to the fully integrated voltage regulator there is you only have to push at 2 volts for 600 watts of power, you only have to push about 300 amps of current. If we were at a lower voltage, this would have to push 600 amps of current, and there's simply no way these power stages are doing that because their package won't allow it. They will die if you try to push 60 amps through an 8-phase, 50 amp power stage built VRM. So the fiber does have its benefits, but it does also have its downsides. The end result is that these will put out quite a lot of heat, but they will survive as long as you can cool them, whereas if you didn't have a fully integrated voltage regulator, you would very easily be looking at operating voltages of, say, 1.6, 1.7 volt, 1.5 to 1.6 volts, and very, very high current draw, and the VRM would not appreciate that. So the effect is that, say, for that 300 amp max current usage, that's really like extreme, this VRM would put out about 7 watts per phase, because you have 5 watts from just the regular curve for the 3556, and I'm not actually using a 3556 datasheet here, I'm using a 3551 datasheet because the 3556 datasheet is not the full one is not publicly available. Luckily, International Rectifier, their different power stages in terms of specs are very, very similar. So, like, the 3056 will not differ that much from the 3051. The 3056 will have better frequency tolerances and that kind of thing, and it'll be more efficient across a larger frequency range. But ultimately, these should be very comparable to the 3551, so I'm just using the 3551 datasheet because that one actually has all the details. So I'm probably going to be saying higher heat outputs than what these will end up doing, because these are newer than the 3551s. So these should be a bit more efficient, but nonetheless, As a reference, the 3551s are also a 50 amp power stage, and they will be pretty close to what these end up doing. So at that 300 amps current draw, 300 kilohertz switching frequency, 2 volts output, this VRM will put out about 7 watts per phase. And with an 8-phase VRM, that means you're doing 8 times 7. That's 56 watts of heat. And suddenly, this giant cooling block starts looking a lot more adequate. Because, yeah, that is a lot of heat. Ultimately, that you'll only be seeing that kind of heat output on liquid nitrogen. On air cooling and water cooling, you can still get Haswell E and Broadwell E into that 400 watt load range. Beyond that, they become really, really impossible, like basically impossible to cool as far as I'm concerned. So there you'd be looking at closer to around 200 amps and a reduction in power consumption, which, well, obviously a reduction in heat output on the VRM, which I didn't do the math for yet, so let me quickly get those calculations up. 200 divided by 8 is what? That's 25. 25, you're looking at about 2.5 watts with that. 5 times 1.4. So you'd be looking at about 3.5 watts per power stage for 25 amps going through them at 2 volts. So that's actually really not bad. Yeah, so as soon as you, because, you know, they're power stages, they're VRMs, basically your heat output on a VRM gets, I think it's exponential with current. Yeah, it is exponential with current. So definitely at lower currents, you know, it makes sense that, you know, you're going from 37 amps at 300, like 300 amps for the whole VRM is about 37.5 amps per power stage. So going from that to 25 amps, you get a huge current reduction. So for daily, you're not actually going to be seeing anywhere near that 56 watt heat output. You're going to be seeing about half that, so about 28 watts. And this giant cooling block will take care of that handily. So definitely Gigabyte did the right thing here with designing this. And dedicating it entirely to the VRM because it does not sink heat into, like, there's no thermal pads on here, and you do have memory power in these areas of the motherboard. So, good decision with the heatsink on Gigabyte's part here. And yeah, you will actually need to run that on liquid nitrogen because this thing will get hot otherwise. So now let's talk about the part of the board which I do really, really like. The memory setup. It is ridiculous what Gigabyte can do when they want memory performance. Like, I've not overclocked RAM on this board yet, but this thing, when it came out, was smashing DDR4 overclocking records because Z170 wasn't really a thing yet. I don't remember the specific timescale when this came out. But this thing was ridiculous for memory overclocking. It is ridiculous for basically overclocking in every sense because it also has the OC socket, but the lengths that Gigabyte goes to when they want good DDR4 overclocking performance, like, it really shows here. So first of all, let's flip the board over. On the back, you may notice we have no pinout for the DDR4 memory slots, and the reason for that is Gigabyte is using surface mount technology for the DIMM slots here, and apparently that is supposed to reduce the amount of electromagnetic interference that the memory slots pick up because you don't have those tiny little antennas sticking out the back. So that should help signal quality. The other thing is, these are almost certainly tantalums. They could also be polymers, but generally this looks like tantalums. Unfortunately, you can get black tantalums and you can get black polymers. You can also get yellow tantalums, but you can't get yellow polymers, but these are black, so they could be either. But you do get these bypass capacitors on the back for the memory. So that's already, like, you don't see large bypass like this on the back of boards. So you do get these what I assume are tantalums, because those would be for higher frequency noise filtering, so they would actually be useful in high frequency applications like DDR4, bypassing DDR4 memory power. And on the front, you know, Gigabyte's just gone absolutely crazy because you have even more bypass capacitance for memory power here, and then more bypass capacitance for memory power there. There's some multi-layer ceramics buried in the memory slots themselves. There's multi-layer ceramics on either sides of the memory slots as well. There's also some on the back. So basically, Gigabyte has just gone crazy with the bypass. And then it gets worse. The power stages for the memory here are ridiculous. So they're using International Rectifier IR3553s. These are 40 amp power stages, and there's 2 phases of them for every set of every 2 memory slots. So you have 2-phase memory power for 2 DIMM slots, which is just ridiculous. You like 40 amp power stages powering 2 sticks of RAM. Crazy. Like, Gigabyte has just gone absolutely crazy when they designed this. So the memory power should be like, it should be a flat line. There's no way if you if you stab this with an oscilloscope, you should just see a very, very, very flat line, because this amount of bypass capacitant, like the bypass capacitors that Gigabyte has gone for, and the amount of them, and then the 2-phase power, controlled by an International Rectifier 3570 for each. So there's 3570, that's a 3+2 phase voltage controller. There's one there. There's another one down here. They have 2 of those, so one of them for each memory bank, running in 2-phase mode, which is just ridiculous overkill. So memory power is just amazing on this on this board. I'm so used to GPUs that I'm like, card. Anyway, so just memory power, ridiculous. Now let's talk about the Vpp rail. This is a really minor rail that is necessary for DDR4 because it's a voltage that used to be generated internal to DDR3, but for efficiency purposes, it's been made external. Each set of memory slots, again, gets its own VPP VRM. So you have one down here and one up there. They're also made with International Rectifier 3553s. This is so ridiculously excessive that I'm 99% sure that those 3553s will be running in like 1% of their total capability. So they'll be loaded up to like 1% of what they can normally do. End result is I think Gigabyte actually killed efficiency with their VRM setup for VPP. Not that it really matters, because ultimately this board isn't about your daily efficiency. This board is about extreme overclocking. And then they've gone and put more bypass capacitors on the Vpp rail than you sometimes find on some motherboards' main power for DDR4. So like this main power rail that I was saying, like that has insane amount of bypass. Yeah, well, the Vpp rail this board comes with wouldn't look out of place as a main power rail on a lot of other boards. Like on a lot of newer DDR4 boards, you will see single phase main memory power, and yeah, 2 560 microfarad polymers would totally not look out of place for main memory power. So Gigabyte's just gone insane here, because it's like there's no way you can do more memory power than this. I mean, yeah, you could step it up all the way to an 8-phase, but at that point, you'd just be like going, this is ridiculous overkill. That would be just, you've lost your freaking mind, and you're apparently getting parts for free from International Rectifier because you're just wasting them at that point. So, yeah, like, where the vCore VRM, you know, it's good enough for what it needs to do. The memory power here is insane overkill. They've just gone absolutely crazy. And it did show. This board absolutely killed it for DDR4 overclocking on X99. There's not really any board that comes near it, except maybe the Rampage 5 Black Edition, or no, Edition 10. And that board costs a hell of a lot more than this board does. It also has 8 DIMM slots, whereas this does only have 4. But this thing kills it for memory overclocking because of just how, like, hardware-wise, Gigabyte has gone all out. Obviously, with memory overclocking, there's also a lot of BIOS work that has to go into it, but this board is from a time period when Gigabyte really, really cared about extreme overclocking. At least from my perspective, it looked like they really, really cared. They still care now, but I don't think they care as much. So this thing is insane. Though I still think the vCore VRM should have been 60 amp power stages. I really don't get why they used 50s, especially because they shoved 40 amp everywhere else. It's like, yeah, it's just a little bit underwhelming compared to what they've done elsewhere. The other interesting thing is these components around the memory slots right here. I have no idea what they are, but I've never seen them on any other motherboard, and I suppose I have a theory that they might be like per channel specific termination voltages, which I have seen on some ROG boards, but they haven't done it this way. I'll have to check the BIOS to see what these actually are. I'm really not sure. I've never seen those, and RAM is really not my area of expertise. After all, well, yeah, but that's really, like, Gigabyte has just gone all out on the memory power here, and just killed it for memory overclocking on X99 at least. Their newer boards, you know, it's like that's another thing is like just because this board has amazing memory power, don't assume that every new board is going to be the same as this. It's generally not. Gigabyte pretty much had one mission when they designed it, and that is to kill DDR4 overclocking, which really shows in the design here. So I'm really happy I got this board for as cheap as I did. So yeah, that's cool. Then if we move on, then down here we have some chipset power for that. Doesn't really matter unless you're doing a lot of BCLK overclocking. You do get some of the sort of switches. Board obviously has dual BIOS. You have the two BIOS chips down here. The board has, so the dual BIOS from Gigabyte is a little bit glitchy on LN2. So this board has the option to put it between single BIOS and dual BIOS mode. Basically, it doesn't disable the second BIOS chip or anything like that. What dual BIOS mode and single BIOS mode on SoC series motherboards from Gigabyte does is basically, if you're overclocking on liquid nitrogen and you have the board in dual BIOS mode, and the board fails an overclock, it will very quickly go to the backup BIOS and recover, like it'll wipe the main BIOS and it'll recover the board. If you put the board in single BIOS mode, it'll stop doing that, so you can force really tough settings to boot. You can just retry. Though this board does not have a retry button. As a CMOS clear, it has a power and a reset. No retry button, so it's not like you can just spam fire it when you see one of those postcodes that you know you can train through it if you just try enough times. Don't really have that on this board, but you do at least get the option to disable dual BIOS mode. Also, you get voltage readouts here, right here. So you do get voltage read points. You have VPP, VS system agent, V-ring. So that's Uncore, VCore, DDR VTT, DDR VTTA, DIM A, DIM B. You get all the voltages you'd basically have to read available right here. So that is, that's cool. What else is there? You get this this right here. So this CPU mode switch, that enables and disables the OC socket on this board. So the OC socket, it originally came out on Asus boards, and it's basically a socket. It's a LGA 2011 socket with some extra pins, because there's unused LANs on the Haswell E and Broadwell E CPUs. Though on Broadwell E, I'm not aware that the OC socket does anything. I think Intel decided to disable it at that point. But at least on Haswell E, those unused LANs, if you fed them extra voltages, you could get much, much better uncore overclocking, which is why when X99 first came out, Asus was just killing it with the overclocking. They were massacring everybody else because it was just a case of, we have 4.5 gigahertz uncore and everybody else is stuck at 3.7 gigahertz. However, very quickly everybody managed to figure out that what Asus was doing with their OC socket, and everybody copied it. So on sort of what I like to call the second wave X99 boards, like the SOC-Champion or the UD4P from Gigabyte, you get an OC socket. The MSI X99A series motherboards, not the X99S, so you have the X99A series from MSI, that also has the OC socket. I'm not sure about how ASRock implemented the OC socket, but they definitely have it as well. So yeah, this is just this is about as good as it gets for extreme overclocking on X99, especially at the price point, because this thing, even at full price, I got it on a heavy discount. At full price, this board was only around 200 quid, so around 200 bucks, 250 bucks, I think. And for a board this loaded with really top level extreme overclocking features, it doesn't get better. Personally, I still think they could have included the plus minus buttons for ratio, BCLK, all of that. A lot of the other SoC boards you see from Gigabyte have a lot more buttons in this area, not so many switches. But ultimately, this board does everything it absolutely has to do, and that is, in my opinion, enough. It does sacrifice a lot of features. I mean, look at that I/O. It's pretty barren. Look at the SATA connectivity is just what the chipset supplies. There's only one USB 3.0 header, but nonetheless, this is an amazing extreme overclocking board. This really, really nails what it means to be an XOC board. And props to Gigabyte. I'm really happy that I got a chance to get my hands on this board, because this thing is awesome. and I really, really hope to use it. I'm not sure when, because I personally hate X99, but I do want to use this board just because this is a cool motherboard. So yeah, you will be probably seeing this in some videos, because this is a cool, cool board. And I'm certainly really, really happy to own one now, which, on that, let's wrap this up, and I need to thank the Patreons for making the acquisition of this board possible. So big thanks to the patrons for that. Yeah, with that, let's wrap up the video. So you should like, you should share, you should subscribe if you haven't already. I did mention the patrons, so I have a Patreon, you can support me there. I also have a PayPal, you can support me there. There's also the AHOC Junkyard, where you can buy hardware. Like, this might one day end up on the Junkyard, so you can buy used hardware that is still working. I don't put dead stuff there. You can find that on the AHOC Junkyard, to support me there. If you have any comments, questions, or that, there's a comment section down below. And yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. And now I need to find OBS, because I've cleverly tabbed out of it, and it's gone. Where is it? There we go. Okay, now then, goodbye.